Welcome to Dialogue. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has warned of the world regressing to the law of the jungle, where smaller and weaker nations would bear the brunt of instability and international order, along with the rules-based system would face severe disruption. While addressing the press, China's top diplomat answered questions on a wide range of topics. So what were the takeaways from the event? What is China's stance on pressing global issues such as Ukraine and Gaza? And what role is China playing in a world full of uncertainty? Join us for discussion live today from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me for today's show are Dr. Zhao Hai, Director of International Political Studies at the National Institute for Global Strategy; Benjamin Norton, Founder and Editor-in-Chief of the Geopolitical Economy Report; Ryder, Founder and CEO of Development Reimagined; and Dr. Eduardo Tzili Apango, Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and Culture at Metropolitan Autonomous University. Welcome to Dialogue. Hannah, I will start with you. I'm sure you have followed the press conference given by the Foreign Minister. So what are the key takeaways you have?
I think the overall key takeaway is the continuity and stability of Chinese foreign policy for the rest of the world. I think that was what Foreign Minister Wang Yi appeared to be really trying to emphasize. And of course, there is an element of how every country's and region's foreign policy has to be reactive to what's going on in the rest of the world. But at the same time, I think the Foreign Minister referred to long-standing positions that the Chinese government has had with regards to different regions or different challenges, and really just saying we are staying calm, we are trying to respond, but based on foreign policy, which has been around for a long time. So I think that was very interesting, and I think I would say that is in line with a lot of what many other countries in the global south are doing as well, and certainly in African countries, many foreign policy positions do remain stable despite different crises and uncertainties.
Mm-hmm. So, Eduardo, do you agree with Hannah? Her observation is if you look at China's policy, indeed, it's a consistency. Policy toward Latin American countries, U.S., Europe, Ukraine or on Gaza. It's basically it's consistent, and there's a stability. In terms of to understand the Chinese policy there.
Yes, of course, I totally agree with what was stated. I mean, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that we are living in a very problematic and turbulent world in which some foreign powers are trying to bully the smallest and weakest countries, and we in Mexico, particularly, and in Latin America region, we are facing challenges, as Hannah said, towards some countries that are projecting aggressive foreign policy via commercial aggression or diplomatic aggression, even discursive aggression, of course. So what I highlight of the press conference is that Minister Wang Yi stated that China will give a certainty in a turbulent world because, of course, we are living in uncertain times.
Right. I think you were talking, of course, reminds people of the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, the disputes over there. That's tariffs, along with tariffs, of course, Panama Canal. But let's dive into, that's arguably the most important relationship, Zhao Hai, that's China and the U.S. into this world, So China's principled, the relationship of policy on the U.S. I would say again is stable, is consistent, based on the principles of respect, win-win, equality, and he called for actually a peaceful coexistence despite the U.S. tariffs, despite Minister Wang Yi being critical of some of the practice, like a two-faced practice from Washington there. Mm-hmm. So how do you characterize the current relationship and also looking forward?
I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that because on the Chinese side we understood perfectly that what's caused the current problem between China and the U.S., which is mostly U.S. domestic politics. And without the U.S. setting its own house right, it's very difficult to expect that the U.S. Policy towards China will be consistent, will be rational, and be long-term. So Chinese side always said that our policies is consistent towards the United States. Our side will maintain stability, and we will cooperate with you if you're ready. But the U.S. side seems to be moving back and forth, from Trump to Biden, back to Trump, and Trump this time is different from Trump last time. Mm-hmm. So it reflects the domestic disturbance within the United States, the polarization, the different ideas of how to make policy towards China. And when people talk about certain consensus, but when you dive in, there is no real consensus other than stand tough on China in terms of specific policies. So again, without having a real solution of U.S. domestic problems, U.S. will basically throw its questions towards us, like fentanyl. Mm-hmm. And other issues toward the Chinese side. So ultimately, we hope that the U.S. will get its own foreign policy clear, and then just like Foreign Minister Wang Yi said repeatedly, that working towards us and working with us, and ultimately that's how we settle the difference and having a rational dialogue and having a pragmatic relationship.
Mm-hmm. We're talking about this because this relationship is of massive importance to a lot of countries there. Let me have Benjamin here. Of course, fentanyl was used as a pretext basically to impose more tariffs. 10% actual tariff on the Chinese goods. So how justifiable is that, Benjamin?
Well, like you said, it's a pretext. It's not justifiable. We should keep in mind these are additional 10% tariffs. So now the U.S. tariffs on China are around 30%, and Trump wants to continue increasing them more and more. We saw the same thing, for instance, with Mexico and Canada. Trump wants to justify imposing these aggressive unilateral tariffs, so he accuses these countries of not doing enough, allegedly, to stop the flow of fentanyl. In the case of Canada, in the case of Mexico, it's already ridiculous. The Mexican government has taken a lot of action to try to stop the flow of illegal drugs. But in the case of Canada, we can clearly see that this is completely absurd. There's basically no fentanyl coming from Canada. So it's obviously a pretext. And I think what the importance of Foreign Minister Wang Yi's press conference is that it shows on the international stage which country is truly the adult in the room. The United States, unfortunately, you can say that U.S. foreign policy has also been consistent despite Trump's changes. It's been consistently interventionist around the world, seeking conflict. Whereas the good thing about China's foreign policy is not just that it's consistent, but it's that it is based on principles of non-intervention, non-interference, respect for sovereignty, and the concept of win-win cooperation and mutually beneficial development. In that sense, China's foreign policy is the opposite of U.S. foreign policy, regardless of whether it's, a Republican or a Democrat. Unfortunately, U.S. foreign policy is based on this principle of maximizing its global influence and seeking hegemony. And it's very refreshing to hear Wang Yi and other Chinese diplomats emphasize that they don't want a world with great power competition, which is what Trump seeks. They don't want a world with more conflict. They want a truly multipolar world. And as Foreign Minister Wang said, a multipolar world is one in which all countries, regardless of their size, have equal opportunities, have their voice expressed on the international stage, and can pursue their own independent paths of development without fear of foreign interference.
Mm-hmm. Zhao Hai, of course, Foreign Minister Wang Yi also talked about this U.S. Practice of surprising the Chinese tech progress. For example, the restrictions of the export of advanced chips. This is one example. Dozens, if not hundreds, of Chinese companies were already put on all kinds of like a list, basically being basically restricted from access some of the parts. But the reality is, if you look at the Chinese progress, for example, DeepSeek and other companies like robotics, for example, breakthroughs one after the other. The latest report saying that because of the U.S. suppressing, actually you have Huawei and then the Chinese semiconductor company, they are making breakthroughs in advanced chips. So some are blaming the U.S. government for doing that. It's kind of like forcing China to be more innovative in pursuing those technologies, those products. So that's a failed practice.
Yeah. Because the United States wanted to suppress China's development, there are two ways to do this. One, in the competition between the two countries, the proper way is to compete and see who runs faster, which means that you need to self-strengthen and you need to invest in your own tech development, in your own talents and technology development. But right now, look what Trump is doing. It's cutting back its own health research, its own basic science research. And then the other option, of course, is to try to slow down the other side. What's better than imposing more export restrictions and having more investment restrictions and try to prevent the development of China's side? However, he's mistaken is that China is not China 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. China has self-generated innovation power within China. It's no longer like copying or learning or even running behind the U.S. technology. In many ways, we're running ahead. So this kind of
solar panels, EV, right?
EVs, yeah. So there are less and less area where the United States can impose that kind of restriction that will prevent China's development. So chips, like you mentioned, is the last area where the U.S. can really exert some pressure on China. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, that restriction will be gone either. So this is a no-win situation for the United States. Of course, this is no win for China. So again, a rational policy is two countries working together and push the parameter of the technology even further and benefiting the whole world.
That's true. Foreign Minister Wang Yi said that neither side will benefit from such a tariff, war of tariffs. Haina, looking at China, U.S., U.S. with Mexico, Canada, from a European point of view, how do people see that? How do people take that?
Europe has its own disagreements at the moment with the U.S. and challenges with dealing with the new administration's views on Europe. And so I think, although one could say, if there'd been a lot more understanding of where the new administration might be coming from, a lot more studying of things like Project 2025, to really, have a lot less confusion around why the new administration is doing what it is, then perhaps Europe would be in a slightly different position of understanding where the US is coming from. But I think in general, there is still a lot of uncertainty in Europe. There's also uncertainty of Europe with regards to China as well, whether Europe should see China as a competitor and should only view China through that lens, or whether there is another way forward, and in what case, how that would situate Europe with regards to the US. There was mention of this idea of multipolarity, and I think we're in a stage, certainly for this year, of working out whether multipolarity is going to be the way forward, or whether it is just competition. And I think there's many across the world, I wouldn't say in Europe, but let's say in India and the African continent, for example, where there's expectations and in a sense almost an aspiration for a multipolar world, where that actually might not only provide a race to the bottom, but maybe a race to the top in terms of really opening up the box of tools that countries can use in their foreign policy, but also in terms of economic management. And there's been only a few set of rules which have been dictated from one place, and now maybe something will be opened up. It's a very uncertain time.
Yes, a very uncertain time. Of course, we are moving toward multilateralism. It's really about like what kind of a multilateralism, a multipolar system, for example. From the Chinese point of view, like the speech given by Minister Wang in Munich Security Conference, that China expects every country is equal, respectful of each other. And then that kind of a multipolar system, everybody will benefit from that. So that's why he warns of this what we call like this law of the jungle system, right? Might makes right. And so, Eduardo, how do you, as someone from a country very close to the United States geographically, and of course you have your own tariff issue with the United States. How do you look at this kind of a possible return, let's say, of to the practice of the law of the jungle?
Yeah, I think what the U.S. government precisely wants is to provoke instability in the world. So, in order to obtain many gains, many benefits through bullying foreign policy. That means I think that it is like shaking, like the world politics, sending very mixed signals, very confusing, but strategic narratives, and of course foreign policy actions. So in Mexico, we are seeing the U.S. government try to obtain the more gains through the most pressure way, right? So we in Mexico are trying. Well, Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum is trying to impose like strategic patience, because if we react. We think that if we react like without cold mind and in a very strategic way, maybe we could fall into the trap of the U.S. foreign policy game, in which we can like start a tariff war.
Yeah,
I think Chinese government is trying like this also, like is very patient, and is strategically speaking, and is conducting a very wise foreign policy to not let the bully make us react aggressively, of course. Yeah.
Right, not worse the situation there. But Hannah, you mentioned, of course, the China and EU relationship. I want to have your view here, Zhao Hai. China, EU, partly because of the Ukraine issue. EU has been, let's say, accusing China of siding with Russia. That whether that's true or not. Anyway, that's the accusation there. The relationship is being affected. But at the same time, right now, we are seeing this realignment of the U.S. policy, with Russia, betrayal of Ukraine, or abandoning the European Union. In such a situation, of course, while trying to maintain a sound relationship with the U.S., is there a possibility for China and the EU to work together to overcome the differences, in a way that will benefit both sides?
Yeah, I think it's a wake-up call for European countries during the Munich Security Conference, right? When G.D. Vance gave the speech and talk about Russia is not the enemy, China is not the enemy, actually the enemy is within. And European countries suddenly realized this transatlantic alliance may not be as solid as they thought. And China has been calling for a more strategically autonomous Europe all along. However, European countries believe that depend more on the United States on the security side is better for their own sake. However, now they realize that they have to beef up their own security, invest more. That's what they're recently doing. And Germany promised to invest a lot more in terms of their military and security. However, on the other side, just like today, if you've noticed, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said very clearly that we need to rethink about the origin of the conflict in Ukraine instead of just thinking about the solution of that. And that is the lesson we need to learn. And the lesson is that we need to prevent and use particularly diplomacy, to prevent conflict before it began. And I think there's a lack of trying before the beginning of that conflict. And the West, and particularly some European countries, want to blame China for having a normal relationship with Russia after the outbreak of the conflict. So, so now we're standing at a new beginning. Maybe European countries will rethink about the whole process and then reestablish its connections with China and think in a more rational way, because China never posed any real geopolitical threat to European countries, and economic relationship can be negotiated.
Yeah, and of course, previously, because of that's the heavy influence from the United States, European countries somehow, aligned themselves with Washington against China, over a slew of issues, for example, over Hong Kong, over Xinjiang, over Taiwan, in a kind of ideological, let's say, war against China, and of course over Ukraine too, and here. Minister Wang Yi said, we need to learn something. We need to learn from the conflict. That is, no country should build its security on the insecurity of another, and all countries can learn something from the crisis. So, without real disputes, real issue between China and the European Union, are you positive that there's something they can do together to stabilize their relationship, as well as becoming, like a stabilizing force for the world?
Absolutely. I think this could be a great opportunity for the people of Europe, for the people of China, and for many countries. In fact, I just saw the latest news is that the European Parliament ended its ban on members of the European Parliament from meeting with Chinese officials, which, that ban was absurd. It was basically a ban on diplomacy. So they're allowing politicians in Europe to have more interchange with their counterparts in China. That's a great step forward. There's a lot of trade and investment going on. I saw recently that BYD is opening up numerous factories across Europe. These are all opportunities that also for, a continent like Europe, which has fallen behind, especially in a lot of cutting edge technologies. This kind of Chinese investment could be very important, especially at a time when Trump is saying he wants to cut trade with all of these regions, and he wants the U.S. to be this insulated, self-reliant economy. Well, this could be a great opportunity for Europe to finally pursue a path of strategic autonomy. When Trump was president the first time, we heard, former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Macron, they talked about this idea of strategic autonomy. Nearly a decade has passed since then, and actually Europe has only become even more deeply ingrained with the United States, more reliant on the United States. This would not only be good for China, of course, it would be very good for the people of Europe. Look at the consequences we can see. Germany is deindustrializing, far-right parties are rising all across the region. Numerous countries in Europe are entering recession. They have chronic economic problems ever since the 2008 financial crisis, which was largely caused by the U.S. financial system, but because of the way that Europe was so deeply integrated with the U.S. financial system, Europe's economy has not really recovered in nearly 2 decades. So I think that the people of Europe, the politicians in Europe, should see this as an opportunity to finally forge a more independent path. It would be much better for them.
Well, this year marks the 50th anniversary of China-Europe EU relationship. Hopefully that could be an opportunity for the two sides to do something more to improve their ties. And speak of that, Hainan, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The minister himself, of course, as a practice, he paid his visit to African countries, become the first visit, overseas visit at the beginning of every year. He also outlined, actually, over the past 25 years, China has helped build or upgrade nearly 100,000 kilometers of roads in Africa and more than 10,000 kilometers of railways. And in the past 3 years alone, so Chinese enterprises have helped created more than 1.1 million new jobs. Even talked about a farmer from Africa, shared his rice, with people in Hunan, where the famous scholar, of course, the father of the grain rice, that's hybrid rice, was born there, lived there. So that's how close this relationship is. Like, what's the prospect do you see this year and the year and then beyond?
Yeah, well, there have been a lot of great achievements, from farming to finance, even supporting some of Africa's largest institutions like the African Development Bank. For 10 years, had an agreement with China called the Growing Together Fund, Africa Growing Together Fund, worth $2 billion, and that just expired last year. So there are some great agreements that have been in place, great achievements, and there's a lot more to come. And I think we can expect more because of the last Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which happened in September last year. And during that forum, the announcement was of continued financial support or openness to African countries borrowing, and of course paying back China for a lot of these types of activities, of roads, bridges, railways, etc. But also from the African side, a real push and encouragement of Chinese firms to do much more in terms of value addition on the continent. Where we're talking about deindustrialization in the rest of the world, we expect the most industrialization in the next 20, 30 years to be happening in Africa. And that's something that African countries want China, as the world's largest manufacturing hub, to be heavily involved in, but also other areas like the US and Europe to also be involved in equally. So this is again the commitment from China to say we're listening and we're going to help shape through government policy is something which was very welcome, and we expect to see a lot more of in 2025.
Well, of course, China, Africa, Latin American countries, they are all part of the global South or the global majority. Ben, the Foreign Minister also mentioned about the rise of the global South is the hallmark of our era, accounting for over 40% of global GDP and contributing as high as 80% of global growth. And he said the global South is a key force for maintaining world peace, driving world development, and improving global governance. Your comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. He was being very generous there. In fact, if you measure GDP at purchasing power parity, according to the IMF, the emerging markets and developing economies are 60% of the global economy. So the majority of the world population and the majority of the world economy, and growing. And there are so many opportunities. One of the guests mentioned that Africa, for instance, is embarking on a very important program of industrialization. Many countries in Latin America also that have deindustrialized in recent years, they want to reindustrialize as well with help from China and Chinese investment. This could be a great opportunity for people in all these regions of the world, because if countries do want to lift their population out of poverty, if they do want to develop, it will take industrialization, it will take significant investment in infrastructure. And China is the world's leader in infrastructure development. We've seen that through the Belt and Road Initiative. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. China has shown by example that you can lift 800 million people out of absolute poverty. China alone, according to the World Bank, has been responsible for 2/3 of global extreme poverty reduction in the past 4 decades. So a lot of people in the global South are saying we want to collaborate more with China so we can develop, lift our people out of poverty, and trade for mutually beneficial development. And if some leaders want to, create a big fence around their country and treat the rest of the world like, they're pariahs and they don't want anything to do with them, well, I think that's going to hurt the people of those countries. But China and the global South can continue going forward in mutually beneficial relations.
Well, with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.